At age 76, Charles Nelson Reilly exposes NBC's dark secret about gay actors, and it's not pretty at all. Today, I want to take some time to tell you about a man that perhaps many of us, those who grew up with American television in the 60s and 70s, still remember clearly. That's Charles Nelson Reilly, a comedy icon, a genuine artist, and a silent warrior against discrimination. Imagine a sensitive boy born in the Bronx, New York City on January 13, 1931, growing up in poverty and chaos, labeled strange by society just because of his artistic nature. Then he grew up, entered the entertainment world, only to be outright rejected by a major network like NBC because he was too gay. But Charles didn't stop. He rose up, conquered Broadway stages, dominated television shows, and at age 76 threw an emotional one-man show called Save It for the Stage, The Life of Reilly. He exposed that dark secret to the whole world. This story isn't just about success, but also about pain, love, and the power of living true to oneself. From a boy who loved opera to an LGBTQ+ icon who paved the way for authentic representation on screen. First, let's go back in time to the 1930s, when Charles Nelson Reilly was born on January 13, 1931, in the Bronx, New York City. He was the only son of Charles Joseph Reilly, an Irish Catholic commercial artist who specialized in painting advertisements, and Sina Elvera Nelson, a Swedish Lutheran mother. The family soon moved to Hartford, Connecticut, where Charles grew up during the Great Depression. It was a time when everything was tough, and Charles's family was, oh boy, a real mess of chaos. Picture a cramped apartment, no heat, no hot water, and a toilet full of fish bones from the weird meals of his immigrant Swedish aunts and uncles. His father had a nervous breakdown after a failed business and ended up in a nursing home. His mother was always irritable, yelling at neighbors, and worse, she often destroyed the puppets that Charles sewed himself to perform with. However, she was also a source of inspiration, often saying, "Save it for the stage," when he expressed his emotions, a phrase that later became the title of his autobiographical play. Charles was a sensitive child who loved art. He enjoyed sewing, creating puppet shows to escape harsh reality, but his parents hated it. His father would say, "Why don't you go outside and throw a ball?" His mother threw away his puppets, even though she inspired the title of his later one-man show. Neighbors whispered, "The Reilly boy is so strange." And back then, strange meant weak, a word full of prejudice. American society in the 30s viewed feminine men as a threat, with newspapers even calling the USC football team weak, like it was a major scandal. Movies portrayed such characters as villains or jokes. I pause for a moment to think, you all, those who lived through that era, probably understand the harshness. Charles was bullied at school, couldn't play sports due to poor eyesight and weak physique. He felt out of place even in his own family, a family where an aunt had a lobotomy to cure hip pain, an uncle sneaked into strangers' funerals for free food, and Swedish relatives ate whole fish, threw bones in the toilet, and yelled at each other in Swedish. Charles once described his teenage years as like being in an Ingmar Bergman film, full of gloom and inner conflict. To analyze deeper, we need to look at the historical context. The 1930s were a time when American society was obsessed with the image of strong men, especially after World War I and during the Great Depression. There was a major scandal in 1934 when a newspaper called the USC football team weak, and doctors warned that the country's future depended on ensuring boys weren't too feminine. Parents were encouraged to bully their weak sons, send them to reform facilities, or even kick them out to toughen up. In movies, weak characters were often depicted as scary villains, failures needing treatment, or simply punchlines. For example, in comedies, they were stuffed into sacks and thrown into rubber like a joke. From my personal perspective, I feel heartbroken thinking about a child like Charles. He wasn't just rejected by his family, but pushed into the role of the outsider by society. But that isolation forged him into a genuine artist. He found escape through art, and the 1944 circus fire was a major turning point. Imagine the scene. One afternoon in July 1944, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus passed through Hartford, and 13-year-old Charles went to watch with friends. The big tent erupted in flames in seconds because the waterproofing material was a flammable mix of paraffin and gasoline. He jumped from the bleachers, crawled out amid the panicked crowd. He escaped, but 167 people died, mostly children and women, and over 700 were injured. This was one of the worst fire disasters in American history, and it left him with a lifelong fear of large crowds. He rarely sat in theater audiences, and when directing, he preferred sitting at the back or near exits. Once on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, he recounted a preview where the lead actress's costume caught fire, but he reassured the audience that these things always work out. And this tragedy could have made anyone fear the entertainment world, but for Charles, it sparked the realization that the stage could heal wounds, bring joy amid suffering. This is one of the most emotional details in his life, and he often recounted it in The Life of Reilly to emphasize how tragedy shapes people. After the fire, Charles started working as an usher at a local theater in Hartford. This was the early 1940s when vaudeville was fading, but radio and film stars still toured. He watched Bert Lahr, the Lion in The Wizard of Oz, the Marx Brothers, Mae West perform live. He saw them breathe life into stories, making audiences laugh, forget daily problems. It was like his private puppet shows, but instead of hiding to avoid getting caught, they did it for thousands. Charles realized, the greatest thing a man can have is laughter. He had to learn to make people laugh. He also developed a love for opera from a young age and dreamed of becoming an opera singer. He enrolled in voice lessons at the Hart School of Music in Hartford, but quickly quit when he realized he lacked the natural vocal talent for a big career. Still, opera remained a lifelong passion, and he became a regular guest on opera radio shows, including broadcasts from the Metropolitan Opera. Later, he directed many operas for companies like Chicago Opera Theater, Dallas Opera, Portland Opera, San Diego Opera, and Santa Fe Opera, and maintained friendships with opera singers like Renee Fleming, Rod Gilfrey, Roberta Peters, and Eileen Farrell. This shows that even without becoming a singer, Charles found ways to stay connected to opera through directing and teaching, and he often shared in interviews that opera inspired his flamboyant performance style. So, as soon as he could, Charles left Hartford, moved to New York with Broadway dreams. New York in the 1940s was a theater paradise, with hits like Carousel or Annie, Get Your Gun, but for Charles, it was hell at first. He did odd jobs, lived in cheap apartments without hot water, even sold blood to afford train fare to auditions, to the point of fainting midway from selling too much. But luckily, he wasn't alone. He studied at HB Studio, where he later taught acting. In acting classes, he befriended young talents, Charles Grodin, Jerry Stiller, Jack Lemmon, Geraldine Page, Barbara Harris, Orson Bean, Peggy Cass, Harvey Korman, Frank Langella, Hal Holbrook, Steve McQueen, Jason Robards, and many who later won Oscars, Emmys, Tonys. They were all poor, all dreaming. And Charles stood out for his humor and hard work. Friends loved him for his ability to make people laugh during tough times. Later, he taught at HB Studio, giving back to the place that trained him, and he often said in interviews that these friends were crucial support, helping him through the early difficult years. But the entertainment industry wasn't easy. Charles started with failed off-Broadway roles, called a bad omen by critics. He was nicknamed the Kiss of Death because any show with him flopped. He performed at the Starlight Theater in Kansas City, Missouri, for many summers in the 1950s, playing comedic roles, and that's where he honed his early stage skills. Then, television opportunities came, or rather, were shattered. A friend arranged a meeting with Vincent J. Donahue, NBC director, who directed stage shows like Peter Pan. Charles borrowed a suit from his uncle, went to the bustling NBC studio. Auditions were lively, but Donahue glanced at him, whispered to his assistant, then said outright, "We don't allow queers on television." Charles left, full of disappointment, but not defeated. This is the dark secret of NBC we're talking about. In the 1950s, being gay was taboo. Actors like Raymond Burr invented fake wives and kids. Rock Hudson faked dates with Natalie Wood. They played masculine roles, hid themselves. Charles could have done that. He was a good actor, had played serious roles, but he chose not to. "I never thought about hiding," he said in a 2002 interview with Entertainment Tonight, where he affirmed he didn't need to explain and never deliberately hid his sexuality. He lived authentically, even if it cost him roles. I feel a bit of mystery here. How did someone rejected like that rise up? It was thanks to friends and talent. Gower Champion, a former choreographer, remembered Charles' diligence, gave him a small role in Bye Bye Birdie, the 1960 hit. He played Mr. Henkel and understudied Dick Van Dyke as Albert Peterson, shining with his signature humor. Then Robert Morse introduced a role in How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. He originated Bud Frump, a clumsy, mean but funny character, winning a Tony for Best Featured Actor in a Musical in 1962. Next was Hello, Dolly in 1964 with Carol Channing as Cornelius Hackle, earning a second Tony nomination for Best Featured Actor in a Musical. The show set Tony records and longest Broadway run at the time. He also starred in Skyscraper, 1965-66, with Julie Harris as Roger Summerhill, and Neil Simon's God's Favorite, 1974-75, as Sidney Lipton. As a director, he helmed Private Lives in 1968, The Belle of Amherst in 1976, Julie Harris as Emily Dickinson, winning a Tony, The Nerd in 1987-88, and the 1997 revival of The Gin Game with Julie Harris and Charles Durning, earning a Tony nomination for Best Director of a Play. In 1979, he directed Ira Levin's Break a Leg, but resigned before opening night due to creative differences, demanding his name be removed from the program and marquee at the Palace Theater, later joking on The Tonight Show that the show ran 2 hours and 5 minutes. Anecdotes like that show his humorous personality, always turning failure into a funny story. From an off-Broadway bad omen, Charles became a Broadway star, turning characters into humorous, flamboyant versions of himself. But Broadway was exhausting, low pay. Charles still dreamed of television. After stage success, he started radio and TV commercials, playing clumsy, silly roles, the kind that fit his style. He debuted uncredited in Elia Kazan's 1957 A Face in the Crowd, a social critique film with Andy Griffith. Then small roles in The Tiger Makes Out in 1967 with Eli Wallach and Ann Jackson, and Cannonball Run 2 in 1984 with Burt Reynolds, Dean Martin. Then guest spots, a neurotic architect in Car 54, Where Are You?, a basketball coach in The Donna Reed Show, a scout leader in Nanny and the Professor. He appeared as mystery guest and panelist on What's My Line, and many episodes on The Steve Lawrence Show in 1965, where he showed his early comedic talent. And the breakthrough, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir from 1968 to 1970, as Claymore Gregg, the clumsy landlord, nephew of the ghost captain. Originally a guest in the pilot, but Hope Lang loved his humor, insisted on making him regular. The show was a hit on NBC and ABC. Charles earned an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Comedy in 1969. From there, his career exploded. He appeared everywhere, regular on The Dean Martin Show, comedies with Lucille Ball like Here's Lucy, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, The Love Boat, Love, American Style, Macmillan and Wife, The Patty Duke Show. In 1971, he played the evil wizard Hoodoo in Sid and Marty Krofft's Lidsville, a kids' show where he wore big glasses, scarves, and a high-pitched voice, becoming a campy icon. He appeared over 95 times on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, often as a last-minute replacement because his house was near the Burbank studio, and was a regular on The Match Game from 1973 to 1982 and the 1990-1991 revival, totaling 1648 episodes across versions, sitting in the bottom right seat, joking about his glasses, wigs, and flamboyant personality. In Match Game 74, he briefly left to film Hamburgers, 1974, and star in God's Favorite. 1970 was a peak year. His name appeared 27 times in TV Guide in 1 week. Audiences loved his eccentricity. Humor, what was once discriminated against, became his brand. He also hosted Uncle Croc's Block in 1975, a kids' show parodying others, with Jonathan Harris, Alice Ghostley, Phyllis Diller. He voiced Killer in All Dogs Go to Heaven in 1989 and its 1996 sequel, Rock-a-Doodle in 1991, Tom and Jerry in The Magic Ring in 2001, and Dirty Bubble in SpongeBob SquarePants in 2000. He appeared in The X-Files in 1996 as Jose Chung in Jose Chung's From Outer Space, and Millennium in 1997 as Jose Chung in Jose Chung's Doomsday Defense, earning Emmy nominations in 1998 and 1999 for Outstanding Guest Actor. But behind the glamour, Charles had a beautiful love. In 1980, he met Patrick Hughes III, a set designer and costumer, backstage on the game show Battlestars, where Patrick was the set decorator and dresser. They courted for just 20 minutes, then became partners for 27 years, living in Beverly Hills. Patrick was his rock. "My life," Charles once said. In an era when being gay was still discreet, they were relatively open, though Charles once appeared on Tattletales in 1974 with Elizabeth Allen as a couple faked to hide. But with Patrick, he was more open, and Patrick announced his death to the New York Times in 2007, emphasizing their deep love. In a 2002 Los Angeles Times article, Patrick tended 800 trees in their garden, and they were described as totally different, but never argued or raised voices. Patrick said, "Charles isn't well. He's had pneumonia all year," in an emotional interview with The Inquirer. That love brought peace to Charles, who had been lonely since childhood. It was like a lighthouse, helping him balance career and life. I get emotional thinking about it. At our age, true love is a treasure, and Charles found it. This relationship symbolized self-acceptance in a discriminatory entertainment industry, and Patrick was mentioned in many articles as his loyal companion. Charles wasn't just funny. He wanted serious roles. He directed plays like Private Lives in 1968, The Belle of Amherst in 1966. Julie Harris won a Tony for Best Actress. The Nerd in 1987-88, and the 1997 revival of The Gin Game, Tony nomination for directing. He directed operas for many companies like La Traviata, The Magic Flute, Die Fledermaus. With Burt Reynolds, he taught acting at the Burt Reynolds Institute for Film and Theater in Jupiter, Florida, where the stage is named the Charles Nelson Reilly Stage. He trained Liza Minnelli, Peter Boyle, Lily Tomlin, and said in interviews that all the awards I won on Broadway, all the TV shows I did, mean nothing compared to teaching and directing experience. He also taught at HB Studio in New York, where he once studied, and he often shared in interviews with Bruce Duffy about his opera passion, saying, "I don't think all these celebrities understand making a play, but it's a disaster. I don't think all these celebrities understand making a play, but it's a disaster." To fund his passions, he did guest roles, voiced in Rugrats, SpongeBob SquarePants as Dirty Bubble, Designing Women, The X-Files as Jose Chung in Jose Chung's From Outer Space in 1996, and Millennium, Jose Chung's Doomsday Defense in 1997, earning Emmy nominations in 1998 and 1999 for Outstanding Guest Actor. He ditched the wig in the late 1990s, appearing bald publicly, and joked about it on shows, saying, "My favorite thing is doing nothing. I'm an expert at doing nothing. I have a boat. I make training films for the Coast Guard. I listen to a great radio station." But the pinnacle was at age 76. Save it for the stage. The Life of Reilly, based on his 2000 one-man show, turned into a 2006 indie film directed by Frank L. Anderson and Barry Polterman. In it, he told everything: his painful childhood in the Bronx and Hartford, the circus fire, the NBC rejection, Broadway success, TV, love with Patrick, and lifelong trauma. He exposed an NBC executive said, "They don't let queers on TV." That was the dark secret. Systemic discrimination forcing many to live lies. But Charles proved them wrong. With talent and authenticity, he talked about going bald, wearing wigs through the 1970s, 1980s, and jokes on Match Game about his hair. He ditched the wig in the late 1990s, appearing bald publicly. His legacy? Game Show Network dedicated a weekend tribute when he died in 2007 from pneumonia complications at age 76. Weird Al Yankovic made the song CNR in 2009, parodying Chuck Norris facts with Reilly's wit, like Charles Nelson Reilly won the Tour de France with 2 flat tires and a missing chain. He was referenced in The Life and Times of Tim and Weird, the Al Yankovic story in 2022. By 2025, he's still an LGBTQ+ icon, paving the way for authentic TV representation. In Netflix's Outstanding: A Comedy Revolution, he's mentioned with Paul Lynde and Rip Taylor as queer comedy pioneers, with campy styles pushing 1970s TV boundaries, contributing to social progress. He participated in the first AIDS fundraiser in 1982 with Sylvester. Joan Rivers at Studio One nightclub. Analysis: Reilly's openness paved the way for LGBTQ+ representation, challenging norms on Match Game, influencing queer visibility in Hollywood. From my personal view, I see Charles as an inspiration for authenticity. His story reminds of progress from 1930s prejudice to today's acceptance, though challenges remain. You all, Charles' story teaches us, living true is worth it. From a lonely boy to an icon, he inspires. Thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed. See you next time.